Welcome to the Economic Justice Committee Initiatives Review. My name is Sharon Kyle. I'm the publisher of the LA Progressive and a member of the ACLU Southern California affiliate, where we have an Economic Justice Committee that is putting this event on along with the League of Women Voters, Pasadena area, LA Progressive, and the ACLU Southern California Economic Justice Committee. Tonight, we're going to be going over the California ballot propositions that are associated with economic justice. To cover our initiatives, we have three great guests. I'm going to be introducing each one individually before their turn to speak. But before I do, I'll just tell you their names. We have Steve Rohde, Renee Christian Moya, Anastasia Foster, and Ellen Greenstone. So thank you for being here, and let me just tell you a little bit about the initiatives that we're not going to be going into depth on. We're going into depth on the California ballot propositions 15, 21, and 22. But as you know, there are 12 different initiatives on the ballot. So of the 12 initiatives on the ballot, those that we thought were economic justice related are Proposition 15, which is going to be covered in depth tonight, and that is called the proposition that puts communities and schools first. Proposition 16, which is a vote to reinstate affirmative action in the state of California. Proposition 17, which is a vote to restore voting rights for people re-entering, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means, that re-entering. Proposition 18, which is a vote to give 17-year-olds a say on important issues affecting their lives. Proposition 19, which is a vote to prevent another tax break that benefits only the wealthy. Proposition 20 would be a vote to protect criminal justice reforms. Proposition 21, a vote for rent control and affordable housing. Proposition 22, which is a vote for fair wages and protections. Proposition 24, which is a vote that we are urging people to vote no on. The ACLU has recently put out that position. Proposition 24 is to reject the fake privacy law that benefits big companies and harms the privacy of vulnerable communities. And finally, Proposition 25. Prop 25 is a rejection of pretrial discrimination. We want to make sure that we end cash bail right away in the state of California. So now as we proceed, let me just give you a brief little, a brief rundown of some of the propositions that we feel we would have given more attention to if we had more time, but we don't. So we'll talk a little bit about each of the propositions that are economic justice related. I'll begin with Proposition 16. Proposition 16 would restore affirmative action in public education, public employment, and public contracting. So there's been a nearly 25-year ban in the state of California. So almost 25 years ago, California rejected affirmative action. And California is one of only 9 states in the United States that has a ban on affirmative action. A yes vote on Proposition 16 would reinstate affirmative action in the state of California. So today, many people are currently discriminated against in getting state contracts, employment, pay, and education based on who they are and where they come from. If you were to vote yes on Proposition 16, it would directly address the systemic racism and gender discrimination and ensure that everyone in California has equal access to good jobs, good wages, and quality schools. Proposition 17, we are urging a vote yes, would restore voting rights to 50,000 people in California who are returning home after their prison term. It allows them to reintegrate into society and have a say in our democracy. Voting yes on Proposition 17 would help reverse a racist form of voter suppression that disproportionately locks Black and brown voters out of the ballot box. It's time to free the vote. Proposition 18 will expand voting rights to 17-year-olds by allowing them to vote in a primary or special election if they will be 18 by the time the next general election comes around. So a vote yes on Proposition 18 would give 17-year-olds a say and give them an opportunity to vote, provided that they will be 18 at the time of the next general election. Proposition 19 creates another tax break for already wealthy property owners by allowing homeowners over age 55 living with disabilities or displaced by wildfires to carry their existing property tax rates to new homes anywhere in the state up to 3 times. Proposition 19 does nothing to address California's unaffordable housing crisis and may threaten funding for schools and essential services in some counties. Voters rejected a similar proposition in 2018. Vote no on Proposition 19 to stop a tax break that would increase inequity and widen the wealth gap. And finally, Proposition 20. We are urging a no on Proposition 20, which would dramatically increase the number of people incarcerated in our prisons and jails by restricting parole release and enacting one of the nation's strictest laws for theft. Vote no on Proposition 20 to stop the police unions from ratcheting up the criminalization and oppression of Black and brown people. Now we're going to move on to our panelists. We're going to begin with Stephen Rohde. Stephen Rohde is a past president of the ACLU Board of Directors, a retired constitutional lawyer, lecturer, writer, and political activist. He is the immediate past chair of the ACLU Foundation of Southern California. He is a founder and current chair of the Interfaith Communities United for Justice and Peace, ICUJP, and is vice president of Death Penalty Focus. Stephen Rohde will be covering Proposition 15. Take it away, Steve.
Thank you so much, Sharon, and thanks everybody on this panel and the 100 or so people that are watching us today. We have such an important vote coming up. Absentee ballots have already been sent. I learned today that people are already voting. So we are none too early in looking at these important propositions that are on the ballot. It's imperative that everyone listening to this program vote early. There are all kinds of opportunities to do that, to drop off your ballots, to mail your ballots, or if necessary, vote in person. The ballot measures we're talking about today are some of the most important that have ever confronted the voters of California. And that's certainly true of Proposition 15, which I'm going to talk about tonight. Many of us will remember that almost 40 years ago, there was a proposition that was promoted to help homeowners and renters to restrict increases in property taxes on your homes. But buried in that legislation as an unintended consequence, which got very little attention at the time, was a loophole for large corporations. Existing law freezes large corporations and their real estate taxes at the value of their property at their original purchase, which could be 10, 20, 30 years ago, with only a 1% increase each year. This puts California in a minority of states that do not have regular assessment every year to look at the fair market value of property and assess commercial property taxes based on those values. Now, if I say it once, I'm going to say it several times tonight. And when you take a quiz at the end of this program, I'm just kidding, it is to say that Prop 15 does not raise taxes on homeowners and residential properties, despite the scare tactics that the no on 15 folks have been using. It is simply and expressly focused on commercial industrial properties. And even there, it protects small businesses so that any business property worth $3 million or less is exempt from these new provisions. What's important about Proposition 15 for the rest of us is that the best estimates are that it will raise $12 billion a year. That's what these large corporations have been getting away with not paying for almost 40 years. That $12 billion will go into schools and communities. It will be an extraordinary boost to the economy of California and to the people of California, particularly at a time when we are struggling under COVID and when minority communities and people of color are especially impacted, not only historically by disparities in wealth and income, but especially during this period of COVID. So it will allow local communities to decide within 60% to communities and 40% to education how these new revenues will be distributed. The opposition to this initiative is overwhelming because these corporate interests do not want to give up their special privileges and their exploitation of this loophole, which they've enjoyed for decades. So you're already seeing on television scare commercials, misleading commercials, some distorting and twisting the entire notion of Prop 15. And we've got 9 slides to look at that address some of the scare tactics which the opponents to Prop 15 are using. Sometimes it's good to look at what your opponents are saying in their scare tactics in order to decide what the truth is. So this is yes on 15. It's the very first item when you receive your ballot, so it's in an excellent position to get a huge turnout. Scare tactic number 1, when it comes up, and that's what we're debunking today as we move to scare tactic number 1, it is the notion that the commercials are using that it's the largest property tax increase in California history. See, when they do an attack like that and they scare people with property tax, then everybody will think of their own tax and the tax they pay as if that's the tax that is being increased. But as I think I've explained to you, that's misleading. It closes the loophole on the largest property taxes, and that's why it's one of the largest increases in history. Now, the truth is it still keeps the rate at 1% when it is reassessed, which is one of the lowest business property taxes in the United States. So the related scare tactic is this is going to drive businesses out of California. That too is a terrible myth. Let's turn to scare tactic number 2 that the opposition is using. Hurts small businesses. Well, as you see here, that's not true. It exempts small businesses under $3 million or less. And the truth is that 80% of the revenues from Prop 15 come from only 8% of the businesses in California, because those are the largest ones and they're the ones that have been artificially held back all these years. This will actually provide a tax cut for small businesses, which is not what the opposition is willing to tell you. We look at scare tactic number 3, claiming that consumers will see higher prices. This is a fiction. We as consumers, homeowners, renters already pay the price every day for these corporate loopholes, because it has shifted the burden of property taxes so that 72% of property taxes today has been shifted to homeowners and residential properties. This is, it will not result in consumer prices being raised. Taxes rarely result in direct increases. Businesses are in a competitive marketplace and they have to fix their prices by what competition will bear, not necessarily what their property taxes are. Wealthy commercial property taxes don't pay their share. The burden is falling on the rest of us. Scare tactic number 4, there's no accountability. They throw around the notion, they remind you about the lottery income and some of the scandals. This proposition has nothing to do with that. There is direct language in the proposition that the disclosures shall be made every fiscal year, including the annual budgets, and even going so far as to say that the disclosures shall be made so that it is widely available to the public and written so that it's easily understandable. You know, frankly, it's laughable that the opposition wants accountability when so much of their campaign is largely funded by secretive special interest groups that don't even disclose who serves on their board of directors. This legislation requires strict accountability and transparency. The 5th scare tactic is that there are no taxpayer protections. This is hard to understand because Prop 15 prevents Sacramento politicians from diverting any of the new revenues. The new revenues go to schools and communities. It places the responsibility on local schools and communities and counties and school districts to decide. And the proposition specifically forbids and provides that it shall not be subject to appropriation, reversion, or transfer by the legislature, the governor, the director of finance, or the controller for any purpose. There are strong protections for taxpayers. Scare tactic number 6 is the classic one you've already heard, and you could give the lecture on this one by now. They claim it's an attack on homeowners. Nothing could be farther from the truth. It expressly, in the language of the proposition, protects homeowners and renters. They scare by saying this will lead to another proposition someday, somewhere. Well, let's face that proposition then when we can all organize around that one. But let's look at this proposition and not be swayed and distracted by the opponents who are only trying to protect their corporate loophole. Scare tactic number 7 says it's a job killer that will force businesses to leave California. They know this isn't true. They hired a biased consultant to write a report, and even their hired guns had to admit that Prop 15 would create a net 20,000 new jobs. It will keep California at the 1% limit at some of the lowest property taxes in the country. California business property taxes in our 8 largest cities are far below the average of all of the other major cities. There are a lot of good reasons to do business in California. Proposition 15 in supporting small businesses will only increase that. Scare tactic number 8 says it will overturn Prop 13 protections for agriculture. They're trying to appeal to farmers and others. This one is an outright fraud. Section 3H of the text says, and I quote, "This measure makes no change in existing laws affecting the taxation or preservation of agricultural land." It protects agricultural land. It doesn't even reach any businesses worth $3,000 or less, and it gives a special tax relief for business equipment and agricultural equipment. And finally, we come to scare tactic number 9, which is that it will be too costly and difficult to implement. Well, you know what? It is neither costly nor difficult. We have assessors who are prepared to implement property taxes every year. There is a timed phase in of several years for this proposition to take effect, by which time our assessors will be fully equipped to implement it. If they're not able to implement tax increases on commercial properties, then they shouldn't be our assessors anyway, and we should look for ones who are adept at new technology and the ability to collect these property taxes. So looking at the next slide, Proposition 15 is supported by a huge coalition of groups. Just look at the wide range, anyone from League of Women Voters to the California Teachers Association, California Federation of Teachers, of course, the ACLU, the Dolores Huerta Foundation, Black Workers Center, California Calls, Bend the Arc, a Jewish Action, PICO California, SEIU, Senior and Disability Action. You can read all of these organizations for yourself. Vast numbers of elected officials, the kind of people that you believe in to bring us equality and fairness, are behind Proposition 15. So on the final slide, you can get involved in Proposition 15. It's as easy as going to yes15.org. You can follow us on social media, as you see on the screen. You can sign up for phone banking at mobilize.us, schools and communities first. This is a very important proposition. The idea that we can bring in $12 billion in new money every year to support the kind of programs that help the people of California. What's wrong with that? So this coalition tonight, the ACLU and all the organizations we've talked about, urge you to vote yes on Proposition 15. Thanks very much, Sharon.
Thank you, Steve. That was extremely informative. And we had several questions come through. So let's go to our Q&A portion.
Sharon, for some reason, I can't hear you. I don't know about others.
Somehow I got muted.
Thank you.
So, good. Okay, so the question is, can you briefly discuss how Proposition 15 will help rural communities? There's been a discussion that the rural communities don't have enough high-priced real estate to balance off the extra cost and increased deductions incurred. Also, the agricultural community is saying that there is a drafting error that will result in cost growers having more cost applied to nut and grape harvests. Sounds efficient.
I think that agricultural farmers and rural communities have everything to benefit from this initiative. It will be done on a county by county basis. The added influx will be in those communities. There are large corporations, many of them ride under the radar in all cities and counties in this state. I know of no grammatical error of the kind that the questioner is asking about. This was very carefully written and this proposition has been worked on for decades and more recently for several years. This is carefully written to benefit farmers, to benefit communities, and I think that's just what it will do.
Thank you, Steve. The next question, the questioner would like to know if increased taxes collected via Proposition 15 would stay within the county where they're collected. So she says, if so, that means a few counties will get a lot of money and other schools will stay badly underfunded.
I understand the concerns. It's similar to the last question. The larger communities also have larger expenses in terms of the running of school districts, of larger teacher budgets, of larger community budgets. So there is a certain proportionality in terms of the money that will be raised. But this was meant to be a degree of fairness, not to send this money up to Sacramento, where there has been some abuse and there are always questions of how that money would be distributed. At least under Proposition 15, you can go to your county boards of supervisors, you can go to your city councils, you can seek the best use of these new and additional funds.
Great answer. Thank you so much, Steve. I just want to, first of all, I neglected to thank and acknowledge that this webinar is being hosted by Occidental College, the Department of Critical Theory and Social Justice, where Professor Malik, and Malik, I don't want to mess up your name, so your last name, could you please just say your full name?
Sure. Hi, I'm Malik Moazem Dolat. It's a pleasure to host this. It's a great event. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Malik, and thank you, Occidental College, for helping to facilitate this. So, are there any other panelists that would like to pose a question about Proposition 15 before we move on to our next speaker? Okay, it doesn't look like we have any others. So we're going to go on to our next speaker, and that will be Renee Christian Moya, who is going to be discussing Proposition 21, which is the rent control proposition. Renee is director of the Proposition 21 campaign and is also director of housing. Housing is a human right at AIDS Healthcare Foundation. He is a philosophy and government graduate of Dartmouth College and has a law degree from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Welcome, Renee, and thank you so much for giving us some more information about this extremely important proposition.
Thank you so much, Sharon. And again, thank you for having me on today. It's been quite a long day, in fact, today as well. So it's quite nice ending it in a conversation like this with really with friends. Look, I want to talk to you folks about Proposition 21 on the one hand, because it is addressing one of the most fundamental crises that is affecting the state of California. And also because, like a lot of these issues, it's deeply personal. You know, I'm glad that this is being hosted by Occidental College. I grew up around the corner from Occidental College, and as a result, you know, was able to see a lot of the changes that have affected my community, where gentrification in particular has been taking such has had such a huge impact on Highland Park and really the entirety of the northeast of Los Angeles. Prop 21 is a fairly simple measure. What it does is it would allow us to expand rent control in the state of California at the local level, should governments decide that they want to do that. If your city or your county wants to implement or expand or strengthen its rent control, Prop 21 would give us the opportunity and the power to do that. Specifically, it would allow us to protect apartment complexes that were built after the last 15 years. In other words, we would be able to expand rent control to protect more buildings. Now, why does that matter? It matters because, to use a couple of examples, in the city of Los Angeles, no apartment complex built after October 1st, 1978 can have rent control. If you are living in an apartment that was built in September of 1978, and you are next door to an apartment complex that was built in January of 1979, that apartment complex built in 1979 cannot have rent control. It cannot be protected in the same way that your apartment complex is protected, and therefore you're able to or can receive rent increases that are far higher than the rent-controlled apartment complex. Number two, single-family homes. For many, many years, we all know this, single-family homes were the preserve of homeowners. The vast majority of Californians who owned their own homes owned a single-family home, and very few renters relative to the population of the state of California lived in single-family homes. There's a problem, though. In 2008, we had a huge financial crash that ended up having or costing a lot of people, and in particular, working class people of color, who ended up losing their homes. Those homes were repossessed by the banks. They were then sold off to private equity firms and other forms of corporations, who then converted that housing into rental housing. And so over the last 12 years, we have seen an enormous growth in the number of rental units that are being rented out, of single-family homes that are being rented out to people here in California. In fact, in many cases, we have seen renters who are actually living in the home that they used to own prior to that house being repossessed. And the reason why all of these private equity firms and companies jumped into the single-family home market to rent was because they knew that California restricts rent control. It does not allow us to expand any protections to those units. And so for that reason, we thought that we had to give local authorities the power to do that. And then finally, the third thing that Proposition 21 really does, and it's something that has been illegal in California for 25 years, is the ability to regulate rent increases when one renter moves out and another renter moves in before that other renter moves in. Now, why does that matter? We know that in particular, senior citizens and people of color with families who have been living for many years in an apartment, that oftentimes a landlord, but in particular, larger landlords, corporate landlords, and real estate investment trusts, they know that those folks have a target on their back. Because if they are living in an apartment that is currently going for $1,200 in the middle of Los Angeles, they know that if they can successfully push that renter out, they would be able to jack up the rent to whatever level they wanted. They could double the rent overnight. They could triple the rent overnight. And unfortunately, I wish I could tell you that it wasn't true that this was happening, but in my experience as a tenant organizer and advocate, this happens very regularly. And in particular, this happens to a lot of senior renters who have been living in their apartments for a long time. And so what our initiative does is it allows cities and counties to implement these protections, although with some moderate controls to allow for landlords to recoup some costs. A couple of things I wanted to mention about what Prop 21 does as well. Our initiative does, however, exempt single-family homeowners who own up to 2 single-family homes. The vast majority of homeowners in the state of California will not be impacted by Prop 21. Prop 21 will not impact you because most people do not own 3 homes or more. We all know this. Prop 21 is not a tax. I have unfortunately seen, some folks posting on social media that our taxes are already too high, et cetera, et cetera. Prop 21 is not a tax. We should be very, very clear of that. And then finally, for those of you who are single or rather small mom and pop landlords, statistics by HUD show that the average small mom and pop landlord in this country has only ever really owned 1, maybe 2 units. That means that a significant proportion of landlords in this state will actually be still exempt from Proposition 21. At the same time, though, we will be able to expand dramatically the number of units and the number of renters that are protected by rent control. So that is in a nutshell what Prop 21 does. I want to quickly say two more things though before I move on. One actually is to really kind of pilfer a little bit from the previous presentation about myths and facts. And I know Anastasia will be jumping into this herself in some detail, but the only thing that I really wanted to mention here is that today I unfortunately saw an ad that said that Prop 21 is going to remove rent control in California. Just the most egregious lie. I was shocked when I saw it today. And it's quite the contrary of what the proponents of this initiative are trying to do, which is again to loosen restrictions so that your local community, your local city council, your local county board of supervisors can enact rent control in your city. If you want to do something both to help the 17 million renters of the state of California who are paying too much money on their rent, when over half of the renters of California are paying too much money, on their rent, according to pretty much every single housing institute, when nearly 30% of renters are paying at least half of their income on rent, and when California is the capital of homelessness, with 27% of all homeless people in this state, in the country, and we all know that the driving factor in that growth in homelessness is actually the unaffordable or the lack of affordable housing in our state. We need to do much more. We need to protect more people. And so I really do want to invite all of you to support Proposition 21. And the final thing I'd say, COVID-19 has really put renters in California on the firing line. We know that as a result of COVID-19, up to 5.4 million renters in California could be at risk of losing their homes. That's according to a study by the Aspen Institute. And the important thing about that is that those 5.4 million renters were people who already were at risk of displacement. They were at risk of eviction. They were paying too much rent already, money on their rent already. And so we know that we need to do far, far more. If we are going to have a just recovery from the deepest recession in 100 years, we're going to have to adopt policies that truly protect the people of California, and Proposition 21 is absolutely vital as a part of that. But Anastasia, I know that you have so much more that you want to cover, and I'm going to hand the floor to you.
Okay, so before Anastasia jumps in, I'm going to introduce her properly. We have plenty of time, so no worries, Renee. We do have a question that came through while you were speaking. So I'd like to let you know what the questioner would like to know is concerning Proposition 21, that one of the issues associated with the housing crisis is the low supply of housing. So they go on to say, in our free market economy, where private, profit-oriented developers decide when to build and how much to build, rent control discourages building, which limits supply even further and exacerbates the problem of low supply. So although rent control can help some people now, it appears that it will make the problem worse over time. Does this proposition do anything to address that? And Renee, if you feel comfortable answering that, please do, and then we'll introduce Anastasia. Go ahead, Renee.
Anastasia will definitely have much more to say on that. I will just say a couple of things. One, our initiative exempts new construction. This is the same thing, the same kind of rolling deadline that was implemented in a new anti-gouging law that was passed last year. We know actually that most developers need something like a 10 to 15 year horizon to be able to pencil out and start eking out a profit from their investment. And so our initiative does that. The other thing I do want to say is this, though. Gary Painter, an economist at USC, made an argument 2 years ago that said, when you have a particularly hot real estate market and you do have a supply crunch, as you do right now in the state of California, then actually rent control can induce, under the right conditions, the development of new housing, because what you are doing is you're pushing up the demand for housing so that folks who are wealthier are not competing for the older housing stock like you are seeing right now, where unfortunately what we call gentrification the displacement of poor people by wealthier people, that occurs precisely because if you are, a wealthier renter moving into the city of Los Angeles, you're going to try to find the most price competitive apartment that you can find. And that unfortunately might be a rent controlled apartment or any other kind of apartment that might have been built 40 years ago. But it is still going to be cheaper than buying or renting a luxury apartment that's just been built down the street. But again, I think I would allow or let Anastasia to answer some of those questions more. I know she's kind of itching to do that.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Renee. So our next speaker also on Proposition 21 is Anastasia Foster. Anastasia is a mother, a small business owner, and a commissioner on the Santa Monica Rent Control Board. She serves on the executive board of Meals on Wheels West and is an elected delegate to the Democratic State Central Committee for AD 50. She's chair of the Legislative Committee of the Santa Monica Democratic Club and a member of the Housing Subcommittee of Santa Monicans for Renters' Rights. Anastasia, so happy to have you. Please, go ahead.
Good evening, Sharon, and thank you so much to everybody at the ACLU and Occidental for having me. And thank you, Renee, for that wonderful rundown of what Prop 21 is and what it would do. I've been invited here to give you a few examples of what it's not going to do, or to do kind of like Steve did, debunk some of the myths. Although I don't have a snazzy PowerPoint presentation like Steve had, but I'm a rent board commissioner in Santa Monica. We are the original rent control jurisdiction in the state of California. And if you ask the apartment owners associations up and down the state, they will routinely tell you that we have among the most oppressive rent control charter amendments in the state. That being said, their opinion, we are the only city in the state of California who met our RHNA goals for the last cycle. So in a city with supposedly such stringent and wonderful rent control, we produced thousands of market rate and deed restricted affordable units over the last many years. Some of the misconceptions that the opposition campaign is running were really surprising to me because they're very easily debunked. But it's our job to get out there and advocate for this proposition and make sure the voters are educated and aren't fooled again. So the ads I've seen threaten some kind of a doomsday where upon Proposition 21 passing, there would instantaneously be 150 rent boards throughout the state of California telling everybody what to do with their property. And the fact is that right now, today, any city, municipality, or county who wants to pass rent control can do so right now without this and alongside Costa-Hawkins. For instance, Mountain View and Richmond up in the Bay Area have done it over the last several years, and they survived the court battles and lived to tell the tale to enact their rent control laws. And this is on properties up to the year 1995 in line with Costa-Hawkins. We have Culver City, we have unincorporated Los Angeles County, all just passed rent stabilization ordinances in the last few months and last couple of years. So any city that wants to enact some form of eviction protections and rent control can do so now. However, why do we need Prop 21? It's because we need to be able to edit and tweak for the modern era the demands and limits that Costa-Hawkins has put on us. We're not trying to completely overhaul every single unit in the state. As Renee already said, if your community doesn't feel you need it, if you have an ample housing supply at a very diverse array of affordability levels, then great. What a wonderful community you have. But for those of us who have communities that are squeezed by market pressures, we have got to protect the tenancies we currently have. And rent control is not for poor people. Rent control is for everyone. It's for a community. It can preserve and then control rents at very low affordable levels, at medium levels, and at higher levels, and provide a broad spectrum of affordability across any community. And that's really what it's for. Next, I'd like to address the notion that Prop 21 or any rent control anywhere will dampen the construction of new housing. Like I said, we met our RHNA goals this cycle. We have so many extra units that we just last month had to pass in Santa Monica a ban on furnished corporate rentals because there were so many empty market rate units, because they often will not rent to people for $4,000 or $5,000 a month for a high-rise 1 or 2 bedroom, that they were being let as furnished extended stay hotels. We fought for and successfully passed that ordinance that took effect today, as a matter of fact, in the city of Santa Monica. So after 40 years of rent control, 20 of which were strict rent control, we have never seen a dampening of housing. And let me just say, there's a correlation there that I think you can probably see. If a community is being squeezed by market forces so much that they feel they need rent control, there is probably no shortage of market activity in the housing space. We have never seen that actually come to pass in Santa Monica or the Los Angeles region. Vacancy control is not quite as bad as I think some would have you believe. For example, in Santa Monica, to give you a microcosm, a look at sort of the definition, 30% of our 28,000 rent-controlled apartment units are at historically low rents, meaning they were frozen before 1999 and have experienced the CPI increase every year since then. But some people are able to be in a 1-bedroom apartment for $1,000 instead of $3,000. And the other 70% of our units in Santa Monica that are rent controlled have experienced some turnover or more than once since Costa-Hawkins. So 70% of our front door keys in our rent controlled units are at market. A 15% increase, which Prop 21 would allow for both types of those units, both the older, historically lower rents and the newer ones, are sticking in the craw of some property owner associations. But if you think about it, something that's already $3,000 for a 1-bedroom, even if somebody vacates that unit, is likely that the market will not withstand a full 15% increase on it anyway. So at a market rate unit, there is not much, if any, hindrance on a property owner to get a fair return, which the courts have defined and upheld numerous times, at Prop 21's allowance of a 15% increase. And as for that relatively small number of units that are still at lower rents, well, isn't that great? If only once in every second or third building you had one unit that even at a 15% increase could still be affordable at various levels of affordability across the city for different sized families, individuals, and people who truly want to make that community their home. Not to mention the fact that renters experience stagnation under Costa-Hawkins. Many people who might take on a domestic partner, get married, adopt a child, or have a child are stuck where they are because it's too expensive to make a lateral move without any form of vacancy control. So if I give up my 2-bedroom apartment and need a 3rd bedroom for a relative moving in with me, it will be up to 200% more than what I'm paying currently for the 2-bedroom, and can't make a lateral move. So we don't move. It's actually sort of it backs up the entire system to not have some form of vacancy control. And finally, I'd like to say last year's AB 1482, it was great. It is great. It is the first of its kind tweak to Costa-Hawkins we have had around here in a very, very long time. However, it is not something we can stop at and pat ourselves on the back with and say we did a great job and it's enough. Because allowing for basically what amounts to an 8% or more increase most years, which is the CPI plus 5%, and we know it's usually averages between 2 and 3%, so it's 8%, most households that were already on the margins cannot absorb a year-over-year 8% increase in their rent. Now, does this protect some families from outsized immediate gentrification. Yes, it absolutely does. And we are grateful for it, but it has many, many holes in it, loopholes that were probably unintended, but that are still there, like renovation evictions and not enough in the way of just cause eviction protections, that we can't stop at 1482. 1482 was only a starting point. And again, I don't know how many of you can absorb an 8% increase in your rent, your mortgage interest rate. I mean, who can absorb an 8% increase every single year? So again, I would ask our legislative leaders not to rest on their laurels on 1482, and to understand that if you're to take away anything about Prop 21, it's that it gives cities the choice. If they don't need it, they will not be able to muster the votes to pass it. It will not be automatic overnight rent control for anyone, but it will free communities that have already passed it by a vote of the people to make the necessary adjustments to move forward in a progressive way, to add some more buildings and some more units to rent control. In Santa Monica, we like to stand up and say proudly that we have shown that it can do a wonderful job preserving a wide spectrum of affordability across a very rapidly gentrifying and high interest city in this market. So thank you so much. And I think Renee and I are happy to answer some questions.
Yes, yes. So I thank you so much, Anastasia. So it sounds like Proposition 21 is basically a framework that's established for any city that chooses to enact the provisions established in Proposition 21. We left off with Renee with a question about Proposition 21 affecting the supply of housing. Do you want to address that questioner's inquiry about Proposition 21 somehow affecting builders' desire to build in Southern California, in this beautiful, sunshiny state?
Well, I'd love to add.
Well,
sorry.
Fun.
It's worth noting that in between the time Prop 10 unfortunately failed and Prop 21 was proposed, there was a huge conversation in Sacramento among many stakeholders, tenants groups, building trades, and apartment owners association and realtors. And it was well established right out in the open that 15 years was an acceptable amount of time to recoup an investment, and that 15 years would not be a deterrent to new housing.
Great.
That's exactly right. And I think there are other bits, though, that I'd like to mention. On the one hand, any literature review of the effects of rent control on the construction of housing, empirical review of the literature has shown that actually rent control has very little. It's a very negligible impact on the construction of new housing. And in fact, when we look at the history of rent control in California, but even elsewhere in the country, you tend to see higher rates of construction in cities that have rent control than in cities that don't have rent control. Now, why? Again, if rent control only has a negligible impact on the construction of housing, then that means that other factors are driving the construction of housing. What could those other factors be? It could be the fact that San Francisco and Los Angeles, for example, or as Anastasia knows, Santa Monica, are these big engines of economic growth. They are places that are desirable, where people will want to pay a pretty penny to be able to move into them. And again, these are places where a lot of talent concentrates and congregates, right? And so for that reason, you're going to always have a market, a pool of demand for housing that developers will absolutely want to meet. They'll want to meet it because they know it's in their economic interest to do that. And for that reason, again, not only do we have that empirical literature to show it, we also have, again, very good theoretical arguments to back that up for the same reason. I did also see, Sharon, I think there was a comment in the chat box about the repair issue that apparently a lot of rent-controlled apartments have. And I'm going to unfortunately say two things. On the one hand, the state of California has very specific laws around health and safety violations that all units, whether they are rent-controlled or not, must abide by. In the city of Los Angeles, and I'll use that as an example because I know it the best, we have this program called the Systematic Code Enforcement Program, or SCEP.
that applies to all tenants. It doesn't just apply to rent control tenants. It doesn't just apply to those without rent control. And that program is meant to enhance and ensure that tenants are living without things like mold or, or pests or what have you. Unfortunately, in my experience, I know of too many apartment complexes in the city of Los Angeles that have two things going on at the same time. One, they lack rent control, and two, these apartments are falling apart. I was, for example, leading or co-leading or co-organizing a set of tenants in Lincoln Heights a year and a half ago to 2 years ago, where those tenants were about to receive shock increases in their rent of between 8 and 20%. These are all Latino low-income renters. For them, even an 8% rent increase was an eviction. Those apartment complexes were falling apart. There were bed bugs. There was black mold. The ceiling was collapsing on these buildings. It was a choice by that landlord not to invest in those properties, and frankly, a failure of a lot of folks at the city level not to have called out those landlords for those conditions. It is not rent control that causes those conditions. It is bad landlords who get away with allowing their tenants to live in slum conditions. The majority of the instances where I have organized tenants to fight against slum conditions have been in non-rent controlled apartments, not in buildings that have rent control. And I think that is something that is very important for folks to know, that is the experience of most tenant organizers, at least in the city of Los Angeles. And finally, there is a reason for that I wanted to mention. National legal organizations have pointed out that the reason why you tend to get these slum conditions in buildings where there is no rent control is precisely because those tenants feel that they have no bargaining power vis-a-vis their landlord. They know that a landlord can try to evict them either through fair means or foul if they try to report them to city officials whenever they are living under these slum conditions. And that is in particular an egregious result of again, these kind of like policies, especially in communities of color or in immigrant communities where people are just trying to keep their head down and continue to, live a steady life without any kind of harassment or the threat of an eviction. And so again, I'm going to say from my own experience, but also again, for reasons that a lot of, academics in this space have pointed out, actually, rent control is not the reason why your apartments are falling apart. In fact, there was a study by the University of California, Berkeley in 2016, a study that showed that actually there was no link really between rent control and the inability to keep up to code. If you think that rent control is the reason why apartments are falling apart in Los Angeles, then you can go to cities like Fresno or Bakersfield or other parts of the state where, again, you still have conditions where a lot of tenants are living tragically in slum conditions, and yet there are also no protections for renters. We can have our cake and eat it too. We can protect people and ensure that they're living in healthy, clean, safe buildings, and we can ensure that we're building the kind of housing that we need, because we need all of it. We need to preserve affordable housing. We need to protect renters. And yes, we need to produce truly affordable housing if we're ever going to solve the housing crisis.
Thank you so much, Renee. Your answer prompted a thought that I had. One of the things I've learned as a result of working with this Economic Justice Committee is that there are a large percentage of evictions that occur that are illegal. So just like being a slumlord is illegal, there are illegal evictions. Now, when I say this, I'm saying this to all of the panelists. When we get ready to close, I want each of you to give some time to think about action items that we'd like to ask, things that our viewing audience can participate in so that we can ensure that we don't have these kinds of situations like slumlords and illegal evictions. So we do have one more question that I wanted to pose. Oh, Anastasia, Dick is telling me that you've raised your hand. Sorry, I had a screen on top of your head.
Nope, it's okay. You go right ahead with the next question.
Okay, so the next question someone wanted to know, under this prop, if someone were to sell their property, could they sell it free of rent control and thereby obtain its real fair market value, or will the property remain subject to the leases of the rent control tenants?
I can take this one. If a building is placed under jurisdiction of a rent control agency in a given city or community or county, that designation goes with the building, because it is more often than not based on the year of construction in accordance with a local ordinance or charter amendment. And it does go with the building, but I can tell you that with any sort of ability to raise the rents upon the vacancy of any unit, property values in Santa Monica, I can't even begin to tell you how much equity is packed into this tiny 8.5 square miles. Buildings that were purchased 30 years ago for $200,000 are now worth $3 million. Owners are able to borrow against that equity and use it and take advantage of that enhanced value before they ever sell it. So yes, the designation does go with the building, but there is study upon study to prove that it does not diminish the value of the building.
Okay, now before we introduce our next guest, I have a question. Speaking of values of buildings, Anastasia, do you know of a study that's done that assesses the values of buildings where the surrounding community, or even the community where the building is itself, has a high rate of homelessness?
I can only look as far as my backyard to tell you that, again, astronomically high. The solicitation rate of some of our multifamily real estate brokerages, my own landlord tells me that she calls it harassment, called and door knocked so frequently, pushing for the sale of her building, for instance. And yes, Santa Monica, because of our location in Los Angeles and our wonderful pier and Palisades Park, we are a magnet and our wonderful services our city provides, all put together, we are sharing in LA's homelessness crisis. And to see the homelessness crisis and the tents lined up under the freeway alongside some of the highest rents in the nation. Santa Monica has overtaken San Francisco for highest initial rents in a 1-bedroom apartment. Who would have thought we'd see the day? We have scarcity, we have high prices, and we are setting records for building prices. Though in the last year or two, that has shown just a touch of flattening. And for that, we're grateful.
Thank you so much, Renee. Now we're going to move on to our next speaker. Her name is Ellen Greenstone, and I've known Ellen for a few years now. And until I got her bio, I didn't know this much about you, Ellen. So Ellen is an attorney who has practiced labor and employment law for more than 40 years. As a partner at Rothner, Siegel, and Greenstone, she has represented public and private sector unions in both federal and state court at the trial and appellate levels, in government administrative hearings, in ERISA and public retirement system matters, in discipline, discharge, and discrimination matters, and in collective bargaining. Wow, Ellen, I didn't know that. My daughter's an ERISA attorney.
Ah, okay. I didn't know that.
So Ellen's going to talk to us about Proposition 22, the independent contractor versus employee status for Uber and Lyft drivers. Take it away, Ellen.
Thank you. And thank you all. This has been really educational. I'm going to talk against a proposition, not for it. The ACLU of Southern California has taken a position against Prop 22, and it, like other propositions, is the subject of a great deal of misleading advertising. Prop 22 would carve out and exempt workers who work for rideshare and delivery companies from being classified as employees, and it would as a matter of statute, classify them as independent contractors. Now, I've seen ads supporting Prop 22, and they start out with Sacramento passed a law that takes away the ability of workers to set their own schedules. Sacramento didn't just pass a law. It's the latest in a long history of rideshare companies, app-based companies, having their entire business model based on having their drivers work as independent contractors and not employees. And there's nothing new about the definition of an employee in California. It's very broad. An employer is anyone who suffers or permits someone to work for them. And there are, it deals with the amount of control that an employer has over employees and whether the relationship looks like a common law relationship. And so it's long been the case that employees for whom employers suffer or permit to work are employees. And the distinction between independent contractors and employees has long been fairly well understood. If you think about it, if you have a restaurant, you're the owner of a restaurant and the lights go out, you call an independent contractor, you call an electrician. Because you don't have the skills necessarily to do that. The electrician comes in and you don't tell the electrician how to rewire. That's something the electrician independently knows how to do. On the other hand, a cook is your employee. It's your recipes, you schedule the cook, you say when the restaurant's going to be open for dinner, for lunch. That's an employee. And it isn't, although there are gray areas, it's never been a very difficult call between employees and independent contractors. The app-based companies, Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, Instacart, Postmate, have as the basis of their business model, the drivers for them work as independent contractors. And that's always been a legal problem. In a case called Dynamex, the California Supreme Court reaffirmed the definition of an employee and set out 3 conditions that have to be met before someone can be an independent contractor. 1, the worker is free from the hiring company's control and direction in the performance of work. So a driver would drive wherever. There would be no control. The worker is doing work that is outside the company's usual course of business, and the worker is engaged in an established trade, occupation, or business of the same nature as the work performed. So you can see why an outside electrician who comes into a restaurant would be considered an independent contractor. That person is free from the restaurant's control. They know how to do what they're coming in to do, or they wouldn't be coming to do it. The restaurant doesn't do electrical work. The worker's doing work that is outside the company's usual course of business. A restaurant's usual course of business is serving food. And the worker's engaged in an established trade, occupation, or business of the same nature as what the worker's doing, fixing the electricity. So with respect to drivers, the main point of why drivers have been classified as employees, as they were in Dynamex, that involved an app-based delivery company, is because The company's business was delivery, and the people who delivered for it were accordingly employees. In response to the Dynamex decision, which was a California Supreme Court decision, the legislature passed AB 5, codifying the decision of the California Supreme Court that really limited and defined what an independent contractor could be. And that's the law that Sacramento passed that you hear about in the advertisements, as if all of a sudden California passed a law that barred drivers, app-based drivers, from being employees. Prop 22 is a proposition of, by, and for Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, Instacart, and Postmates to statutorily reclassify their drivers in contradiction to the California Supreme Court decision and AB 5 as independent contractors. So what does that mean? What it means is that Prop 22, as it is written, would enact wage and labor laws specifically to app-based drivers. It would set the wages. It sets mileage reimbursement. It sets a daily driving cap. It provides for healthcare subsidies. And it preempts all local laws, say the city of Santa Monica or the city of Pasadena or the city of LA, cannot pass laws regulating drivers on the theory that people who drive cross city jurisdictions. Same with counties, cannot pass a law regulating app-based drivers. So no local jurisdiction can pass a law differing from what the app-based companies set in the areas of compensation, gratuities, scheduling, leaves, healthcare subsidies, other work stipends, and driver rights with respect to the company's termination of their services. So virtually every working condition of app-based drivers is statutorily set at the behest of the company, app-based companies, Uber, Lyft, etc., and cannot be overridden by any local jurisdiction passing a law. By the same token, the legislature cannot override the conditions set forth in the ballot proposition, except in a way consistent with the purpose of Prop 22 and by a 7/8 majority of the legislature. Now, I don't know any law that requires a 7/8 majority of the legislature. So essentially it exempts app-based drivers from any regulation whatsoever. Meaning they are not subject to the minimum wage in California. They are not covered by workers' compensation. They do not have sick leave benefits that we have under state law. And they don't have access to unemployment insurance. So what does the statute, the Prop 22 provide? Drivers would be paid 120% of the minimum wage for all engaged time. What is engaged time? It's the time they're actually engaged to provide a ride somewhere or a delivery somewhere that's not canceled before they get there, because they don't get paid if it's canceled before they get there. It sets a 30 cent per mile mileage compensation for engaged miles. It provides a subsidy depending on the number of hours worked that can be used as a contribution to buy health insurance under Covered California. It has an anti-discrimination provision. It provides that accident insurance be made available for drivers to purchase. Companies will be required to develop a sexual harassment policy to protect drivers and members of the public, which consists of identifying behaviors that may constitute sexual harassment, indicating that the company prohibits those behaviors, establishing a process for complaints, providing an opportunity for complaints electronically, and a commitment to undertake an investigation. As I said, also it preempts local law and prohibits amendments except by 7/8 of the membership of the legislature, 7/8 majority. And it restricts unionization of app-based drivers by providing that any statute that authorizes an organization or an entity to represent the interests of app-based drivers constitutes an amendment to the statute and has to pass by 7/8 majority. It's even hard to say. I'd like to talk for a minute about the major claim that's made in support of Prop 22, and that is, oh, I can pick my schedule. I can work when I want. If you Google scheduling apps, you will find a myriad of scheduling apps for employees that allow employees, really true employees, not independent contractors, to schedule themselves, for employers to schedule them so that they can work part-time, so that they can be scheduled on time as the employer needs. The algorithms are there. These are app-based companies. They could certainly schedule employees with the flexibility that all of these advertisements seem to think can only be achieved by independent contractors. So that's really a bogus argument to hide the fact that their business model is built on the backs of the people who drive for them, 78% of whom are people of color. They also tout the fact that by a 4-to-1 margin, drivers want to be independent contractors. Well, really, they've been flouting the law for so long, drivers have no basis to compare. They've never been employees driving. So that statistic is really bogus. This is a very sweeping potential law. Prop 22 is not only sweeping in terms of employees, it's sweeping in terms of independent contractors. Imagine if interests in California decided that construction workers such as electricians should be independent contractors in all cases, and they should be able to set their wages and their benefits, and those employees who typically would be independent contractors, the electrician who goes to the restaurant, those individuals couldn't be classified as employees. They would be classified as independent contractors. They would go provide their services. Maybe they'd get paid from the time they got to the door to the time they left the door of the restaurant. That would be a sweeping change in the law, even for independent contractors in this state. And then preempting it so that because electricians, might work in LA City, they might work in Pasadena, that neither of those cities or the county could regulate. That would be sweeping even as to independent contractors. And if the drivers who purportedly support being independent contractors for the flexibility, think about it, in Prop 22, the app-based companies reserve to themselves scheduling, among other things. They can schedule these independent contractors as they wish, as many as they want at a time, as few as they want at a time, for the amount of time that they want, just like an employer schedules employees. So those are the basic facts about Prop 22, and I hope it's clear why the ACLU has taken a position against it.
Thank you so much, Ellen. It certainly is clear to me why a no vote on Proposition 22 is just, it's really, there is no alternative. But we do have a few questions for you.
Sure.
So one of the questions is, can you describe in more detail the unionization restrictions? So we talk about how if Proposition 22 were to pass, there would be no path to having a labor union. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, let me see if I can find the actual language. The actual language is, any statute that authorizes any entity or organization to represent the interests of app-based drivers in connection with drivers' contractual relationships with network companies or drivers' compensation, benefits, or working conditions constitutes an amendment of this chapter, meaning the proposition, and must be enacted in compliance with the procedures governing amendments consistent with the purposes of this chapter as set forth, yada, yada, yada. In other words, the 7/8 requirement. And what that means is that in order to unionize, there would need to be a statutory exception to Prop 22. Do I think that could be challenged? Yeah, I do think that it probably could be challenged because the right to unionize is a basic right of free association. But it's specifically targeted at unionization.
Right, and again, in order to amend the statute, it would take that 7/8.
Right.
Which nobody ever heard of that.
Not that I've heard of. I don't know any requirement. Not even Prop 13 requires that.
So we have another good question. There's someone that is concerned that if we move ahead and we're successful with no on Prop 22, that might possibly impose overtime requirements on people who don't want to work more than 8 hours a day or who don't want to work on Sundays. Is this true?
Well, employees, in people who are employees rarely have imposed overtime. It does happen. It's not as common as people who would like to work overtime and who are not able to, not allowed to. It's an odd question. An independent contractor never earns overtime, no matter how many hours they work. They are considered independent entrepreneurs. If Prop 22 is defeated, nothing about overtime would change. Most people are employees and they are scheduled or work overtime as employees. I guess I'm not entirely sure what the question is.
Right. So I was, for people who haven't seen me, I'm sure you can, most people watching can see me. I'm a Black woman and I have a lot of Black people in my family and several are actually Uber drivers. And one actually lives with me. And I have seen him on more than one occasion, leave the house, come back 10 hours later, only to have made $30.
Right.
That's overtime. I think that's $30 for the entire 10
Well,
hours.
it does depend on what time worked is. And normally time work starts when you arrive at the job. Now, it may be your employer or it may be your first job of the day if you're out in the field. It really depends on how hours of work are defined. And probably if drivers are employees, they would there would need to be a definition of when their day starts, when their hours of work start, but it wouldn't be chopped up into, this little piece when you're engaged in actually picking someone up and dropping them off. And then it, while you're waiting, this little piece. I did, and the scheduling aspect of it is really important because, let me give you an example. I did a jury trial once on the issue of whether particular workers were employees or independent contractors, and they happened to be lap dancers. And they were considered by their club owner to be creative entrepreneurs. And the side of the building said girls, girls, girls. And that was the philosophy, to have as many work at one time as possible, and nobody made money. And if you think about your Uber or your Lyft app, when you look at the phone, you're reassured by a lot of little cars driving around near where you are. Someone's going to give you the ride you need. But a lot of someones are not going to be able to do that. And that's why it's important to have protection as employees, because scheduling then becomes a rational exercise.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ellen. I just, I mentioned that I have people in my family because even though I'm personally am not an Uber driver, I really know about their day-to-day experience. And for example, if you have a dental appointment, you have an appointment coming up at 3 o'clock, you're kind of nervous about taking a call, but you don't really know where it's going to take you because they don't always tell you how far the drive is going to be. So your time is really not your own. You're not as independent as one might think.
You're not really independent at all.
At all. Yeah, at all. Okay, well, thank you, Ellen. I'm just kind of scanning through these questions to see if there were any questions that I missed. I don't think so. Okay, so now we come to the part of the program where I'm going to ask each of you, and I'm going to begin with you, Steve, for action items. Now that you have the platform, you got the stage, what would you ask our audience to do to help us further the success of these propositions, whether we're urging them to vote yes or vote no? What would you encourage them to do?
Well, I think today has been a big step forward of educating folks. We really have to get way past TV commercials on this. It is no substitute for digging in. I would dare say, in a even-handed way, take a look at yes on the propositions we've talked about tonight and take a look at no on the propositions we've talked tonight. And I mean by that the websites and social media and all the rest. Take a look at organizations and individuals you trust who stood by you in previous campaigns, who have your long-term interests at heart, and see what they are endorsing in terms of the propositions you're looking at. That's why I was glad to put up that slide with all of the, I would say, progressive organizations that are supporting Prop 15. The one thing I would say about TV commercials is try to quickly look at the small print at the end of the commercial on the bottom and look who's sponsoring them. If I may be so bold to drift into Prop 22, look who's sponsoring the ads and sponsoring the initiative. It's Uber and Lyft. Do you think Uber and Lyft have the best interests of their employees at heart and are bleeding hearts wanting to provide wonderful benefits to their drivers? Look at the other propositions, the opponents of Prop 15 and Prop 21. That will give you some insight. Educate yourself, look at your trusted partners, look for voter guides. Bend the Arc, a group I'm closely associated with, has a voter's guide. The ACLU has a voter's guide. Other organizations have voter's guides. And then eventually, if you become an advocate for one of these initiatives, then follow what each of us has said today. Find a way to phone bank, to get out the vote. Unfortunately with COVID, we're not going door to door as much, but we do have this amazing technology. I've been doing some phone banking. I bet a lot of you have. It is amazing how it's become technologically simple and easy to call in to people and urge them to take a position on ballots you care about. We cannot sleep through this election. People have fought and died for the right to vote. And the shame in the United States, and to some extent in California, is that usually 25% of the electorate decides elections, because half the people vote and half win elections. That would be like a jury with 3 people on the jury deciding the verdict, 25%. So we've got to be active. We've got to look to friends and families who don't think their vote matters. If ever an election mattered, it's this election, both at the top of the ticket and all the way through these important propositions. I think if we follow some of that advice, if we take advantage of the wonderful speakers we've had today and the education we've had, I believe this event has been recorded, and afterwards we will make it available to those who signed up tonight and to a wider audience. Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you so much, Steve. Okay, Renee, you've got the platform. What would you ask our audience to do?
First off, on the chat here in Zoom, I've just dropped in the link to our website. Go to yeson21ca.org. You can find out a number of things. One, exactly as Steve just said, find out who's on our side versus find out who's on the other side. On our side, we have the California Democratic Party, we have the California Nurses Association, we have the California Federation of Teachers, we have every single renters' rights organization in the state. We have nonprofit developers, including, as of today, the California Council of Rural Housing, as well as the Southern California Association of Nonprofit Housing Developers, as well as the Healthy Housing Foundation, who are part of the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. We know that it's going to be hard to win this because the other side is already outspending us 2-to-1. I know it's not as dramatic as with Prop 22, where the Uber and Lyft and all of these companies have cobbled together $190 million to confuse the electorate. But with Prop 21, we are also faced up against a lot of money. And so as Steve said, if you go to our website, you will be able to find out ways how to text voters, and how to make phone calls for voters, because we need all of that. The final ask I'd make, though, is this. People, the biggest and most trustworthy voice in the life of any of your friends or family members are going to be you. If you've done that research and if you have that opinion, I really frankly need you to contact 21 people for Prop 21. Contact 21 people that you know who are seeing these negative ads, or telling them that if you vote yes on 21, a black hole is going to open up and eat up or swallow the planet. Don't believe the lies. Tell them not to believe the lies of these corporate entities, these real estate investment trusts that are trying to lie to you, so that we can continue to make the same mistake over and over again and expect different results. We need actual change. So please, I implore you, visit our website, yeson21ca.org.
Thank you, Renee. Anastasia, what would you ask the audience to do?
I will keep it short because Renee and Steve have already said almost all of it. I do this exact same thing. I'm an elected official now and a housing advocate and a housing expert now. But just a few years ago, I was just a regular citizen, and I have dozens of friends who rely on me for my biannual email. Every time there's an election, they bother me when I see them out, or, where's my email? Where's my email? Because everyone that attended this call is interested, engaged, and really found out some great information tonight you wouldn't have gotten from any commercial, pro or con. And we really implore you to take that out in the community, post things on social media. People can see it passively and still absorb the message. And also, for all of you worried about your renters out there, a personal note to you, please don't be afraid of trying to enact just cause eviction protections in your community today, tomorrow, then 2022 on the next cycle. Call Santa Monica's agency. We will send you the language to do it. Why reinvent the wheel? Reach out to your friends across the state so we can help tenants and Californians all up and down the state. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Renee. And finally, Ellen, what would you say to the people that think, well, maybe Uber drivers like getting paid $30 over a 10-hour period?
Well, as I said, number one, they don't really have anything to compare to. And number two, there's plenty of flexibility in being an employee. There are plenty of apps that do that. These are app-based companies. If anybody can schedule employees with an app, it's these guys. And third, it's just wrong. I mean, it just, it's wrong to have a business model, at least as I've been fighting for decades. It's wrong to have a business model that depends on your employees paying you, basically. I do want to say the website for the No on Prop 22 campaign is nooncaaprop22.com, or you can go to the website of any union in California, or the California Labor Federation, or the LA County Labor Federation. And I would just say, as everyone else has, when you think about propositions and candidates and elections, look around at the Uber drivers in your family, look around at the neighborhoods that you live in and rent to people in, because all politics really is local.
That's right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ellen. Well, I'm Sharon Kyle, and I'd like to thank all of the panelists and Occidental, the League of Women Voters Pasadena area, Professor Malik, for helping to educate our communities. The LA Progressive, which I am the publisher of, is an online daily digital publication, and we have a list of all of these propositions on the front page of the LA Progressive. Just go to laprogressive.com and look in the side panel and you'll see a list of all of the initiatives. We thank you tonight for attending. We're leaving a bit early. I believe that we've answered every question, and provided there's nothing else anyone else wants to say, I think we'll be closing out. Malik, do you want to close us out?
Sure, thank you. Really grateful to have all of our wonderful panelists. Thanks to the great audience. And we will send out an email that has the information about the panelists, links to the coalitions, and with information, as well as a link to the YouTube video on our YouTube channel that you can share. So that'll go out, it'll come out from CTSJ events. That's why I've left this name up here. When you get that email, it's the email that you registered at, and feel free to share that link and those links.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.